I'm Tom Shelton, Executive Director of the Kentucky Association of School Superintendents. As an educator, I understand the pressures you face in your schoolhouse, and I know it's not easy. And yet, at our core are both legal and ethical commitments to serve our children, which is what Senate Bill 119 is all about. We are all aware of the legal responsibility every citizen in Kentucky has to report suspected child abuse and neglect. Senate Bill 119, which passed the Kentucky General Assembly in 2015, ensures that public school personnel in the Commonwealth can meet and exceed that ethical and legal responsibility by receiving important information about how to recognize child abuse and neglect. And that's a good thing. Kentucky children spend a lot of time with us, and we all need to be equipped to recognize child abuse and know how to effectively intervene. Yes, I know your plate is filled with demands and responsibilities, but keeping every Kentucky public school student safe from abuse and neglect simply has to top our list of professional commitments to make a real difference for kids.
I'm Dwayne Westmoreland, Director of Case Advocacy and Youth Engagement at Kentucky Youth Advocates. First, as a grandfather, I thank Kosair Charities for leading this community in the challenge to eradicate child abuse by 2023. Every day, Kosair Charities is there when it comes to kids. The key to eliminating child abuse takes the commitment and involvement of everyone. That includes preachers, pediatricians, educators, parents, nonprofit professionals, early childhood providers, and many others. That includes you, and it includes me. It is tempting and frankly a lot easier to think that fighting child abuse is someone else's job. As someone who's spent 3 decades as a public school educator, I know you have multiple pressures with high-stakes testing and lesson plans. I also know you take daily steps to protect the children that you teach. And we thank you for that. Part of that protection of your students means making sure you know how to recognize and report suspected child abuse and neglect. So I am asking you to reach deep, think creatively, and place ending child abuse at the top of your professional commitments. Can there be any other truer way to honor our professional code of ethics?
Hello, my name is Lucy Estel, and I'm the manager of the Child Protection Branch in the Division of Protection and Permanency, which is in the Department for Community-Based Services, or you may hear it referred to as DCBS. This training was developed to help you recognize and report child abuse and neglect. So let's get started. These are the basic definitions of abuse, neglect, and dependency. Physical abuse is non-accidental physical injury. Sexual abuse or exploitation is the use of the child for purposes of sexual stimulation, use of the child to engage in acts of prostitution, obscene or pornographic material. Neglect is the failure to provide essential protection, care, supervision, food, clothing, shelter, education, or medical care necessary for the child's health and safety, considering the child's age. Dependency means the child is without essential protection or care, not due to abuse or neglect. Human trafficking is when a child is subjected to engage in sexual acts or labor services in exchange for something of value, such as drugs, money, or shelter. Please note that human trafficking allegations are also investigated when the alleged perpetrator is not in a caretaking role of the child. Other agencies will be talking to you about how to recognize child physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, as well as neglect. Remember, if you are suspicious of abuse or neglect, report it. The indicators presented to you provide information as to what might be a trigger for you to make a report. Even if the child does not make a disclosure or if the child's explanation does not coincide with what you observe. I do want to highlight some indicators of human trafficking and emotional injury in this video, while the other presenters will discuss the other forms of abuse and neglect. Some human trafficking indicators include unexplained truancy, or a child is not enrolled in school, multiple runaway incidents with no explanation as to where the child was, references to frequent travel to other places, tattoos or branding, inappropriately dressed or dressed provocatively, Sudden change in attire or possessions, including expensive jewelry, clothes, or accessories. A victim may have a boyfriend who is noticeably older. They may have multiple cell phones or multiple forms of IDs or fake IDs. Access to one or more hotel key cards, or they may move frequently either in the state or out of state. The child may not know what city, state, or community they're currently in, or there may be inconsistencies in their story. Some physical indicators of emotional injury include bedwetting or soiling, frequent psychosomatic complaints such as a headache or abdominal pain. The child may not have attained significant developmental milestones. Some behavioral indicators include desperately seeks affection, loss of self-confidence or self-esteem, social withdrawal or loss of interest, decrease in school performance or loss of interest, or depression. Some caregiver indicators are unusually harsh or critical of the child, calls the child names or belittles the child, unrealistic expectations, or involves the child in adult situations or attempts to sabotage child's relationship with another caretaker. Kentucky state law is listed in Kentucky Revised Statute, or KRS 620.030. It states that anyone with a reasonable suspicion of child abuse, neglect, or dependency is required to make a report. Reports can be made to DCBS, law enforcement, the Commonwealth's attorney, or county attorney. It is best to make the report to DCBS unless it's an immediate safety issue, because we have the infrastructure in place to determine acceptance criteria and respond to reports across the state. KRS also states that failure to report could result in criminal charges. Everyone is a mandated reporter regardless of your professional capacity. KRS states that any person who has a reasonable cause to believe that abuse or neglect has occurred is a mandated reporter. There is a legal protection in KRS for reporting sources. It states that anyone acting upon reasonable cause to make a report has good faith immunity from liability, civil or criminal charges. This also covers if court action results from the report. Regarding confidentiality, KRS discusses that the reporting source's identity cannot be disclosed to anyone except law enforcement officials with a legitimate interest in the case, members of multidisciplinary teams, or under a court order after the court has conducted an in-camera review of the record of the state related to the report and has found reasonable cause to believe that the reporter knowingly made a false report. So how should you make a report of abuse or neglect? DCBS has 9 regional centralized intake units that take reports of suspected abuse and neglect during regular business hours. Or you may visit our website. You may also make a report during regular business hours by completing the reporting form on the online reporting portal, which is also on our website. And please note, this is for non-emergency reports. If you need to report suspected abuse or neglect after regular business hours, which would include nights, weekends, or holidays, you may contact the statewide abuse hotline at 877-597-2331. So what information do you need to provide when making a report to DCBS? Report only what you hear or see. Do not try to interpret or paraphrase the child's statement. Do not add to or take away parts of the disclosure you feel are not important. Provide objective information. Provide as much information as you can about the family, such as their contact information, last known addresses, or where the child attends school. Also, if there are weapons suspected in the home. This will assist the worker in locating the family quickly. If you hear a disclosure, witness an incident of maltreatment, or if you receive the information secondhand, at that moment you become obligated under state law to make a report. You may ask follow-up questions, however, do not attempt to interview the individual or conduct your own investigation. KRS states that other persons do not have the authority to conduct internal investigations in lieu of the official investigations outlined in this section. Questions that you will be asked when making a report to DCBS include: what is your name and relationship to the child or situation? What happened? Provide specific information regarding concerns and extent of the abuse, neglect, or dependency. What is the current location of the child? What is the current condition of the child? Do you have any knowledge of previous child abuse or neglect issues? Are there any immediate safety issues for the child or investigator? If there are weapons, vicious dogs, active meth lab, or other safety hazards, please include that information in your report. What information do you have regarding the perpetrator, such as their name or relationship to the child, or their whereabouts? After DCBS receives the report of suspected abuse or neglect, the intake worker screens the information provided by the reporting source. The 5 screening options for reports are meets acceptance criteria, which means that an investigator will be assigned. Does not meet acceptance criteria means that an investigator will not be assigned and no further action will be taken by DCBS. Resource link means the report does not meet acceptance criteria, but the intake worker links the reporting source to a community resource, such as community action, a medical provider, the court, or a counselor. Insufficient information means that there is not sufficient information provided to properly screen the report. And a law enforcement assist is a report that does not meet the Cabinet's acceptance criteria, but the report is referred to law enforcement, and an investigative worker will assist law enforcement with their investigation. So why doesn't DCBS accept certain reports? Reports are not accepted when the situation does not meet the definition of abuse, neglect, or dependency, or if the injury is a result of an accident. Remember, DCBS does not have statutory authority to investigate accidental injuries. What happens next? If a report is accepted for investigation, social workers have a required timeframe stated in Kentucky Administrative Regulation in which they have to make face-to-face contact with the victim. If the report alleges imminent safety risks, such as sexual abuse, human trafficking, or serious physical abuse or neglect, the initiation timeframe is 1 hour. If the report alleges non-imminent risk, physical abuse, or neglect, the initiation timeframe is 24 hours. Or if the report alleges a low-risk incident, the worker has 48 hours to initiate the report. These timeframes do include weekends and holidays. DCBS does have a policy regarding notification to school staff. Workers are required to conduct face-to-face interviews with school personnel within 2 working days when school is in session and the child is of school age. And workers are also required to notify the school within 2 working days of the conclusion of the agency's work with the family if school is in session. It is possible that you could be called to court as a witness based on your observation of the incident or the family. The takeaway from the training is that everyone is a mandated reporter. Remember, if you are suspicious of abuse or neglect, report it. The Kentucky Child Abuse Hotline number is 877-597-2331, and our web address is www.chfs.ky.gov.
My name is Dr. Melissa Currie. I'm a child abuse pediatrician, medical director, and chief of the Kosair Charities Division of Pediatric Forensic Medicine at University of Louisville. Child maltreatment occurs in all ethnic, social, and economic groups. It can and does happen in nice families. We'll start with a case example. Let's say as an educator, you're walking down the hallway in a school and you see a kindergarten student with a bruise on his ear. You can see that pictured here. What do? Well, to start with, it's perfectly okay to ask the child what happened to him. We just want to do that in a private and casual manner so that the child doesn't feel intimidated or scared that they're being questioned. Let's say you do that and the child looks at the floor, and when you ask what happened, he says he fell. Based on his demeanor, you can decide whether you want to continue to ask questions or stop there. You could choose to ask when it happened, whether it hurt, whether a grown-up was around when it happened, and what they did. But if the child seems uncomfortable, it's okay to stop there. This needs to be reported to DCBS. DCBS is called the Department of Community-Based Services. That's what we call Child Protective Services, or CPS, here in Kentucky. For the rest of the presentation, I'll be referring to that state organization as CPS. When it comes to how we can make sure we don't miss abuse, One of the most important things is just simply to consider the possibility of abuse in any child we see who has an injury or a new behavior that we might think is concerning. It's okay to ask for explanations from verbal children for any injury that is visible. Keep it subtle, low-key, and conversational. Photographs are really important, especially for child abuse pediatricians and investigators. So, when possible, help facilitate photographs being taken. If that's not possible in the school setting, letting the social workers with CPS know that photographs are necessary can be helpful. And then finally, keep written documentations of your interactions, as close to word for word as possible. That includes both what you said to the child and what the child said to you. Bruises or contusions are basically just bleeding beneath intact skin. They can be caused by blunt forces that include a rapid strike, a continually applied pressure like a squeezing or a pinching. But bruises are the earliest, most easily recognizable early warning signs of abuse, but they're also the most commonly missed early warning signs. The following photographs in the remainder of the presentation may be disturbing for some viewers. There is a rule that can help us decide when bruises in children are concerning and need to be reported, and this is called the 10-4 rule. 10, T-E-N, stands for torso, ears, and neck. So any bruising of the torso, ears, and neck in a child under 4 years of age, or any bruising anywhere in a baby under 4 months of age, are very concerning and need to be reported to the authorities. When it comes to older children, there's some variation in the rule, but essentially neck and ear bruising is still a very rare accidental finding in older students. Here are some examples of ear bruises. As you can see, any part of the ear can be involved. The bruises can be large or small, single or multiple. The important thing to understand is that ear bruises are incredibly rare from normal childhood wear and tear or accidental injury. When we see ear bruises, we need to report those to Child Protective Services. These are some examples of neck bruising. Again, the neck is a very vulnerable part of the child's body and not an area that is typically injured with normal childhood activity. So if we see bruising in the neck area, we need to report that as well. It's also helpful, I think, to understand what normal bruising looks like. And in general, children start earning their bruises once they've started pulling up on furniture and taking steps. So the saying is that those who don't cruise rarely bruise. Children tend to bruise on the front side of their bodies over what we call bony prominences. So that ends up being the forehead, elbows, and then the knees and the shins end up getting the brunt of it. One myth that's commonly perpetuated in the media and in other places is that we can date bruises according to their color. This is really not possible. So if we're in a position of describing bruises that we see on a child, it's important not to attempt to say whether they're old or new. It's better just to describe their color and their location and their shape. There is a very common birthmark that we see in many children called Mongolian spots or slate blue nevi. And these are dark blue, greenish birthmarks that can be thought to look like bruises. If a parent tells us that this is a birthmark, this is okay to accept. These tend to be over the child's low back and buttocks, but they can be on the face, the arms, or really anywhere on the body. This is a common patterned injury that we see in young children, and this particular child was presented to his medical provider with the history that he had run into the wall. However, as you can see, the bruising on the side of his face is stripe-like, and the following slide shows how those stripe-like bruises come to be. They actually occur in the spaces between the fingers when a hand impacts the face. So this is a classic inflicted slap mark on a child. These tend to be on the left side of the face, and they tend to slope downward from the ear toward the jaw. Another common inflicted injury that we see in children is the inflicted human bite mark. And while most of these occur from bites from other young children, there are adults who bite children as well. And these are particularly worrisome because adults who cause injury to children by biting oftentimes are the most dangerous and sadistic of perpetrators. Loop marks are another common patterned injury. We can see multiple examples of loop marks here, and basically what we see is a negative impression of the object that strikes the skin. These can come from belts, electrical cords, phone cords, wire coat hangers, essentially anything that's thin and flexible enough to conform to the contours of the body upon impact. We often are asked how to make the decision when to call Child Protective Services if we know a child incurred their injuries as a result of physical punishment. As we all know, spanking is legal in all 50 states in the United States. So when do we call Child Protective Services? Well, it varies state by state, but in most places it generally comes down to injury. While we're allowed to physically discipline children, we're not allowed to injure them in the process. And so if we're seeing bruises or other injuries as a result of physical punishment, that needs to be reported to Child Protective Services. It can be helpful to understand the family dynamics and other contributors to child maltreatment. Domestic violence, criminal history, and substance abuse are by far the top 3 indicators, especially for fatal abusive injury. That's both here in Kentucky and in most states in the country. Untreated and undiagnosed mental illness is a very close 4th. But one common thread that runs through so many of the families in whom we see physical abuse of children is unrealistic expectations for the child's developmental level. And from that perspective, it's important for us to understand that as educators, we can help families understand what appropriate expectations are for their child's given age and developmental level. Some common red flags for child abuse that can be important to keep our eyes open for are injuries, of course. That's when the injuries are multiple, if they're patterned, like the ones you just saw a few minutes ago, if they're frequent or unexplained or in the 10-4 distribution. Children who wear long sleeves or turtlenecks, even when it's warm or hot outside. Children who usually wear their hair back, who now are wearing it down and allowing it to cover their face. Sometimes they're doing this to help cover up injuries that they don't want other people to see. Stealing food, falling asleep in class, and truancy can all be indicators of neglect, as can a fall in grades and behavior issues. Those can be signs of both physical abuse and neglect. And one very common indicator for a higher risk situation is when we hear that a new adult has moved into the child's home. This may be a parent who has been recently paroled from prison. It may be a parent who has recently come back from overseas from serving in the military, or it may be a new boyfriend or girlfriend of one of the child's parents. These are high-risk situations and worth making note of. Other red flags are if we happen to know that the child was drug-affected as an infant. Those children are at higher risk. If you know that a child has brothers or sisters who are not living in the home with them, that can be an indication that Child Protective Services has previously been involved with the family and has removed other children. Children who have multiple addresses or move frequently, that can be a sign of housing instability and general chaos in the family. And then if they have new behaviors like aggression toward themselves or others, or withdrawn behavior. As far as things to look for, I mentioned truancy and falling asleep in class, stealing food. All of these can be signs of neglect. And that often raises the question, how do I know the difference between neglect and poverty? We know that we have many, many children in the state of Kentucky who have food insecurity, housing insecurity, and other signs of poverty. Some of the questions that I have found helpful in my own practice to help distinguish when is a child poor versus when are they neglected. We'll start with hygiene. If a child has hygiene that is affecting his or her ability to make friends, for example, if they have an odor that's causing other children to not want to sit with them at lunchtime, that is actually impairing that child's function, and that needs to be reported to Child Protective Services. However, that still doesn't necessarily mean that there's neglect in the family. If the child's hygiene is very similar, for example, to the parent's hygiene, sometimes that can be an issue that Child Protective Services can address and fix without any negative consequences to the family. On the other hand, if we have a child who has very poor hygiene and yet the adults in the home are very well cared for, that can be a much more ominous sign of a targeted child or a child who's not being cared for intentionally. Other questions that we can ask about are clothing. Sometimes clothing is tattered or stained or wrinkled, but if it's appropriate for the weather and is adequately protecting the child from the environment, chances are that's not going to be considered neglect. The same goes as far as whether the clothing of the children is significantly different from that of the parents. That can help us distinguish whether this is a family-wide issue or whether this is a targeted child. We also have hunger and housing instability. Issues like this are important to report not as a punitive issue for the family, but rather to secure additional resources for the family. I believe many of us often think that when we make a report to Child Protective Services, we're somehow accusing someone of doing something wrong, and this couldn't be farther from the truth. Sometimes we're simply acknowledging that this is a family and a child who needs additional help and resources, and that report can help secure those resources for the family. So please, if you're ever in doubt as to whether to make a report to Child Protective Services about neglect or just resource poverty issues, do so, because that can really lead to a positive outcome for the family. There is research that shows us that there are certain groups of people that we're more likely to overlook when it comes to noticing the early warning signs of abuse. This includes Caucasian families, those that are considered to be intact, meaning mom and dad live together in the home with the child, middle-class, well-educated parents, and essentially any family that we perceive to be similar to our own. So this is important information for all of us to understand that we carry intrinsic biases about who we suspect abuse in and who we don't. There are some tips for talking to children. As I mentioned before, it's perfectly okay to ask a verbal child what happened to them. We just want to stay casual and conversational. We don't want to ask leading questions. Leading questions are those that suggest a specific answer by the way the question is asked. We want to document the child's answers as soon as possible after we talk with them, as close to word for word as we can. We also want to document what words we used when we asked the questions. But probably most importantly, when it comes to talking with children, especially as an educator, is understanding the tremendous positive impact we can have when we just simply let a child know that we care about them, that we're available if they want to come talk to us about anything in the future. There is adequate research now that shows that having that kind of adult interaction in childhood contributes to resiliency among children who have experienced adverse childhood events. Here are some examples of safe, non-leading questions. These are questions that you can ask of a child and not have to worry that you are somehow contaminating an investigation. And again, it's important to write down how you asked the question in addition to how the child answered it. When it comes to talking with adults, this sometimes can be a challenge, especially for those of us who have built a bond with the child themselves, because we may feel protective and have some feelings of anger or frustration with the adults who we may worry aren't doing their jobs when it comes to taking care of children. I think it can be very helpful to remember that it never hurts to be nice to a perpetrator, but we can do irreversible harm by being rude or accusatory of someone who hasn't done anything to hurt their child. Benign curiosity when we're talking with parents, simply seeking to understand where they're coming from and how the situation has come to be, can be helpful. Nothing is gained by being confrontational, accusatory, or judgmental. When it comes to prevention, there are lots of things that we can do in the world of education to help prevent child maltreatment. Having difficult conversations with parents when we have concerns, talking about choosing safe caregivers for children, and asking what might be going on with the parent that may be contributing to the child's issues can be helpful. Offering positive parenting strategies. We have a tendency sometimes to tell parents lots of things they shouldn't do, but we don't often replace those with things they should do, like reading with their child and doing age-appropriate outings. When it comes to reporting, in Kentucky, any person who has a reasonable suspicion that child maltreatment has occurred is required by law to report this to Child Protective Services. The number to make this report is on the screen. When it comes to reporting, we're allowed to do so anonymously, but it's usually best if we identify ourselves, especially if we're educators. Educators have a certain credibility when they make a report to the Child Protective Services hotline. They'll want to know the child's name, their address, where the child can be found, and then, of course, any specifics about what you're seeing in the child and why you're concerned. If you have concerns about imminent risk or actually being concerned for the child's life, say so, and make sure they understand the degree of your concern. Also, if you happen to be aware of younger siblings in the home, let them know about those children as well. Making the call to the hotline in a school setting sometimes poses an administrative dilemma. Oftentimes, the administrator in the school wants to be the one to make the call because they need to be in the loop and understand what is said. In the meantime, the teacher or some other staff member is the one with the first-hand information who has either spoken directly to the child and or seen the injury themselves. The best solution to this is simply to have both the teacher and the administrator make the call together on speakerphone so that they're both contributing their part. It is absolutely critical for Child Protective Services to hear directly from the person who actually saw or heard the things that were causing the concern. Other things that you can do when making a call to the hotline is to ask the hotline to read back to you what they have recorded about your report. This will help ensure that they capture all the details that you have provided about why you're concerned about this child's safety. Write down the name of the hotline worker and also the case number, and then give them your contact info so that they can contact you after the investigation and ask follow-up questions. So take-home messages are that linear and other pattern bruising is common and often overlooked in young children. Remember the 10-4 bruising rule and that bruises can't be dated. Photographs are really important, especially for medical folks to do evaluations after the fact. It can be helpful to be kind and respectful to families when speaking with them about what's going on with their child so that we can build an alliance with them to keep the children safe. It's okay to ask open-ended, non-leading questions of children. It's just important that we document clearly.
I'm Pam Darnall, President and CEO of Family and Children's Place. While not all children who exhibit these behaviors or traits have been sexually abused, there are some common behavioral indicators. Difficulty concentrating or staying on task, agitation and irritability are common. Lacking motivation and showing little or no emotion may also be signs of sexual abuse. Unexplained episodes of anger, rage, or moodiness may occur. A child who has been sexually abused may make strong efforts to avoid or to be with a specific person without an obvious reason. Behaviors such as not wanting to change clothes in front of others or participate in physical activities may be other indicators of abuse. Being consistently dirty, lacking sufficient clothing, or begging for money or food may also be indicative of sexual abuse. Sudden changes in behavior may occur, such as becoming more withdrawn from normal or routine activities, being more aggressive toward family, friends, pets, or toys, or unexpected changes in school performance. The child may start coming to school or activities early, staying late, or not wanting to go home at all. Sometimes children experiencing sexual abuse assume more of a parental role with younger siblings, often as a protective measure. Play may be absent or may be violent, or the child may engage in persistent play with sexual themes. The child may express feelings of hopelessness, depression, or self-hatred, or may actually harm themselves or attempt suicide. Some children experience nightmares and sleep disturbances and may regress to bedwetting and other behaviors too young for their current developmental level. Older children may develop substance abuse problems, have eating disorders, or run away from home. Another indicator is when a child displays knowledge or interest in sexual acts that are inappropriate to his or her age, excessive masturbation, or even displaying seductive behavior. Physical indicators may include unexplained injuries, pain when toileting, and trouble walking or sitting. Pain, itching, bleeding, or bruising in or around the genitals, or a sexually transmitted disease or pregnancy, especially under the age of 14, are all red flags. Sometimes a parent's demeanor or behavior sends red flags about child abuse. Warning signs include parents or caregivers who do not provide adequate adult supervision or who are emotionally absent. These parents or caregivers often isolate the child from others, including peers. They may show little concern for the child, seem unable to recognize physical or emotional distress in the child, and may offer conflicting or unconvincing explanations for a child's injuries. If staff or teachers see these adult behaviors, they would want to consider if they have observed any of the other indicators already mentioned. If several indicators, along with these parent or caregiver behaviors, have been observed, the staff would want to consider calling Child Protective Services. If a child discloses abuse, it is critical for you to stay calm, listen carefully, and be a source of safety and support. Manage your own emotions and do not overreact or underreact. Be aware of what your tone of voice, body posture, and expressions may be communicating. The child needs you to be the adult, to be in control, and to provide safety. How you respond will influence what the child chooses to tell other people about the situation. Allow the child to share at his or her own pace, using his or her own language. Do not press the child for details. Do not make remarks that question the child's experience or even confirm the experience. Just let the story unfold. Use your own experience to help you understand what the child may be feeling, such as fear, hopelessness, shame, or guilt. It is okay to ask feeling-oriented questions that allow the child to share their experience safely without asking specific questions about details. You may make supportive comments such as, "I'm sorry that happened to you. I understand what you are saying. That must have been difficult for you. I can understand how you might have felt afraid or confused or angry. How did you feel? How do you feel now? You sound like you feel angry, sad, confused, or scared. You look angry, sad, or confused." It's okay to feel angry, sad, or confused. Assure the child that their feelings are okay. Most importantly, assure the child this is not their fault. Thank the child for telling you and reassure him or her of your support. Do not promise to keep something just between you and the child. Do not ask for additional details about who, what, when, where, or how. That is the job of the investigators. Do not try to sort out what is true or make discounting statements such as, "Are you sure you did not misunderstand?" or "He or she would not have done that. You are wrong." Or, "That isn't that bad. It could have been worse." Your job is simply to listen to the child. Call in the report immediately. Document your actions and follow the policies and procedures of your school.
Thanks for watching. For additional resources and information on how to be a face that ends child abuse, visit www.faceatabuse.org.